All right, great. Thanks for the intro, Camille. My name's Connor Corbett. I'm a forester with Diamond Head Consulting, specialize in wildfire management in a variety of different capacities. I'm a former wildland firefighter myself, and I've been working throughout the province of BC and Alberta on wildfire fuel management, kind of landscape level planning, and still a little bit of fire suppression stuff here and there. And I've been working in the district of North Cowichan for the past couple of years, helping support some wildfire work. And today I'm going to be talking about what we've been working on for the past couple of months and the next steps we have sort of moving forward in wildfire, what we're calling Wildfire Mitigation 2021, which is a group of projects that are all related. And we're going to be focusing on one of those projects in particular today, a component of one of those projects. So I'll just get my slides going here. So a little bit of background, wildfire mitigation in British Columbia and in most places is a phased approach. It starts off with what's called a community wildfire protection plan, which myself and Diamond Head completed in 2020. And building off that community wildfire protection plan, which itself is a landscape level plan for wildfire risk and wildfire risk management, it includes a host of recommendations for reducing wildfire risk for the area that it's focused on. And we had several high priority recommendations that the district is following up on and implementing some of those recommendations. These three projects are, the first is fire smart assessments for critical infrastructure. The second is the wildfire development permit area. The third is fuel management prescriptions, of which there are 3 fuel management prescriptions. And kind of overarching all these projects is a communications and engagement strategy for the 3 projects. And that's what we've been focusing on for the last couple of months, myself and Camille, developing this communications and engagement strategy, because a key part of the community wildfire protection plan is education of the public, of knowledge of wildfire risk, of knowledge of what can be done, knowledge of what the district is doing. And so to do that, we've developed this website you can access at northcowichan.ca/wildfire. This has a lot of detail on all of the project components, and we're continually updating it. I think we just did a big update with some of our new information, and it'll continue to be updated. And in addition to this website, we have several open houses, which have just started beginning. I think our first one was last week, and there's going to be many more in the future. And at the end of the presentation, I think we'll throw a link into the chat for the next one. And so I'm just going to start by kind of really quickly discussing the other project components, just to get everyone up to speed before we focus in on the fuel management prescriptions and what we're doing in the Tzouhalem management area. So first, we're doing critical infrastructure assessments. This is, the district is conducting these, what were called fire smart assessments, to make sure that their critical infrastructure, so these are things like water infrastructure, municipal buildings, fire halls, making sure these are resilient in the event of wildfire. At this stage, we provide assessments only. There's no actions occurring, but we're setting the stage for future mitigation work by identifying deficiencies and issues with respect to wildfire. So these generally focus on the vegetation immediately surrounding the asset. So if there's flammable vegetation, how that should be managed, what can be done. And then the second is retrofitting some of these assets to reduce the wildfire risk. The second component is the wildfire development permit area, where this is guidelines for development on private land in high-risk areas. This is sort of an extra set of guidelines that'll apply to areas that have been identified as a high wildfire risk. So what that means is there's 2 components. The first is the area that we have assessed as being at a higher wildfire risk. And the second component is the guidelines for development in those high-risk areas. These are really common in British Columbia in higher wildfire risk areas, but there's definitely a multitude of options, and we just are working with staff right now to figure out the best options and what options are available to them. So we're in fairly early days for this project component and the critical infrastructure fire smart assessments. And so for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about fuel management prescriptions. I'm going to start by discussing what those are in general, and then zeroing in on the Tzouhalem treatment area. So there's 3 fuel management areas, treatment areas we call them, and these are areas of high wildfire risk that are managed by the district. So these are all in the Municipal Forest Reserve, where the 3 areas we've identified are on Mount Tzouhalem, at the top of Maple Mountain, and on Mount Richards. Each area gets its own fuel management prescription, which is an actual document and appended maps. And these are completed to standards provided by the BC Wildfire Service and other provincial legislation guidelines. And we have completed the Mount Tzouhalem prescription, which I'll jump into in a couple slides once I kind of explain what fuel management is in general. So fuel management is a way that we can reduce wildfire risk in forests. That's the simplest way to understand it. And there's a bunch of different parts that occur in that. So the first phase of fuel management is to identify the area. And that's what we do in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. And the second is you develop a fuel management prescription. And that's where we're at right now, is we are developing these fuel management prescriptions. And they are essentially plans. They're planning documents that describe how to take a high wildfire risk forest and turn it into a lower wildfire risk forest. So to really give you a simple example, this is an area we worked in fairly close actually to the district of North Cowichan. And this is an area of high wildfire risk. It's directly adjacent homes. It's very similar to Tzouhalem in some ways because it's directly adjacent private homes, and it's also a major recreation area. And this is obviously, I think it's easy to see that there's lots of debris on the ground. There's lots of tree density. There's really high tree density, and it's just a bit of a mess in this site. And so this is the before we did the fuel management work, and this is the after. Exact same forest. We just cleaned it up a little bit, thinned it out, and actually just on the left of the photo, you can actually see the trail I was standing on when I took this photo. And I think if they did it, the contractors did an excellent job here, and I think most people who are recreating here have no idea that fuel management has occurred here. And this is just a great visual. We might come back to it a couple times to sort of explain some of the things that have been done here. So the best way to understand a fuel management prescription is to break these three terms up and explain them all, and then we can kind of tie them back together and it'll make a lot more sense, I think. So the first thing we want to think about is fuel. Fuel is the organic material that sustains a wildfire. That's what we mean by fuel. So it's trees, needles, branches, grass, logs. It's the soil that has organic material in it. It's the duff. And fuel is a spectrum. There's certain forests and certain forest types that are much more flammable than others. And that flammability depends on what composes that forest, what type of vegetation it is. Generally speaking, coniferous, so needle Christmas tree looking trees are more flammable than deciduous leafy maple type trees. And it also depends on how those fuels are arranged. Like I said, some are very low flammability and therefore very low wildfire risk. Some are high flammability, and when they're close to homes or things that we don't want to burn, they become a high wildfire risk. And in British Columbia, we have a very interesting challenge when it comes to fuel, because almost all our forests are coniferous forests that have evolved and depend on wildfire in some capacity. And wildfire is an important force in nature for these forests. But within our coniferous forests in BC, there's obviously a huge range of different types of coniferous forests. And we have some coniferous forests that are very low flammability. And the flammability of these forests is dependent on the composition of those fuels and the arrangement of those fuels, like I said. And what we do is we like to think about fuels in different layers. So we have the surface layer, which is the stuff on the ground. It might be the really thick duff on the ground. It might be dead logs and branches and needles on the ground. And then we have the ladder fuels, which are kind of the shrubs, the lower branches of trees, the smaller trees, kind of the in-between stuff. And then we have the crown, and that's the aerial canopy of the tree where all the needles are if we're in a coniferous forest. And it's where the crown is where most of the most flammable fuel is. And one thing to understand about wildfires is almost every wildfire, pretty much every wildfire that's ever happened starts as a surface fire, and it either remains a surface fire or it begins to engage the crown. And once the fire engages the crown, there are very limited tools to suppress that fire. It becomes a bit of a force of nature that even with all the tools that BC Wildfire Service has available, it's very, very difficult to suppress these fires or even control them in any way. And so one of the key things when we're thinking about fuel is avoiding crown fires, because we have very little control over them. And when we think about flammable forests, these are the characteristics we see of highly flammable forests. So there's high volume of fuel. There's a lot of continuity between those three layers. There's a lot of continuity within the layer, and there's a lot of dead fuel, and there's a lot of conifer fuel. And I've highlighted in red the 3 characteristics that we see in a lot of the forests in North Cowichan and all over the South Coast in the kind of drier ecosystems we see. The forests are almost always coniferous dominated. They're very productive, so there's a lot of biomass, there's a lot of fuel, and there's a lot of continuity because the forests are very continuous in a lot of these areas. So that's a very quick description of fuel in the context of wildfire. So let's talk about management. So wildfire risk is a matrix of probability of wildfire and consequence. The probability of wildfire is driven by the fuel, and the consequence is driven by that forest location in relation to things we don't want to burn. And so wildfire risk, when we think about what we can manage, we can't really modify things like weather or terrain or the location because we can't move the forest away. So our only really feasible way is to reduce, the only feasible way within a forest is to manage the fuel. And when we say management, what we mean is we're going to alter the composition and arrangement of the forest to reduce the flammability. So we're basically taking a highly flammable forest and turning it into a lower flammability forest. And that sounds kind of simple because we know the characteristics of low flammability forests, but because we have so much biodiversity in BC and so many different types of forests, you can't just do the same thing in every forest. You have to make them site specific, and you have to kind of relate that to the type of forest and ecology you have. And that takes us to our third term, which is prescription. And this is the plan. And this is where we integrate what we know about fuel management and make it specific to the site. So we want to lay out our objectives for reducing the wildfire potential in this site and lay out a set of strategies to achieve those objectives. And so the one thing to remember that's very, very important is that while we are focused on reducing wildfire potential in these areas, we're not doing it at the expense of everything else that's present in the forest, because we need to make sure that these forests are still producing the important values or values that we derive from our experiences in the forest. So that could be things like recreation values is a great example. We don't want to be obliterating the trails in an area just to reduce the wildfire risk. And biodiversity values are another thing that's very important in a lot of these forests. And thirdly, a lot of these higher wildfire risk forests are directly adjacent people's homes. They're right in people's backyards, and people are very attached to the forests that are in their backyards. And we want to make sure we're integrating some of the things that are important to people in these forests in our fuel management prescriptions. So that's the quick sort of 5-minute explanation of what a fuel management prescription is. It's a very technical document that we provide, so it's a lot to unpack. So I'm going to keep it very general, but I'm sure people will have lots of questions that I'm happy to answer on these. And so jumping right into our fuel management prescription for the Tzouhalem area, this was identified in the Community Wildfire Protection Plan as an area of elevated wildfire risk. And that's because of the fuel characteristics and the proximity to homes. It's a second growth Douglas fir forest. So this area has been historically harvested, probably for timber. There's a ton of recreation trails that I derived a lot of enjoyment from this summer when I was doing the field work and riding my mountain bike around. And there has been some work in this area previously for wildfire risk reduction and for other reasons that we'll discuss. There's been thinning. And so this is just the zoomed out map of the area we started off with as for our assessment area. So here's a photo of Mount Tzouhalem that I took from our drone while we were doing our field work. And I just want to kind of look at this photo a little bit and remind you of some of those characteristics we see in highly flammable forests that are visible here. So one, you can see that this forest is very continuous, that you can barely see any breaks in the actual forested portion of this site. Secondly, it's almost completely coniferous forests, which are the more flammable, coniferous trees, which are the more flammable types of trees we see. And thirdly, this is a very productive area. These trees are really tall and they're quite large. I think the average is 40 or 50 centimeters diameter and over 30 meters tall. So it's quite large trees in this area. And then this next photo is similar, taken from the exact same spot, but the previous photo is facing east. This photo is facing northwest. And you can see Cowichan Lake in the background there. And the reason I have this photo here is you can see on the left in the middle is the parking lot, and behind are homes, which are directly adjacent to this treatment area. So that's kind of the two pieces of the puzzle we're working with in terms of probability and consequence of wildfire. And so working from where we started with our overall assessment area, this is kind of where we finished. And this is the entirety of the treatment area for the Tzouhalem fuel management prescription. And the total area is 80 hectares. And one of the things I really want to make clear is it's going to be a very slow phased approach to implementing this prescription. And by that, I mean that we're not going to be tackling the whole 80 hectares at once, and we're not recommending that for the district. We're recommending a smaller start of about 15 hectares, kind of concentrated near the northern central part of the treatment area. And to give you some more discussion on what we're actually recommending be done in this area is we're really focusing on what's happening on the surface and the surface debris and the dead wood on the ground. One of the nice things about working in Tzouhalem is that there's not a lot of work that needs to be done to achieve those BC wildfire service thresholds that we're trying to aim for. It's actually very close. So we don't have to do a ton of work. We don't have to do extensive tree removals or extensive thinning. Our focus is on that surface debris and the removal of dead trees, small dead trees, and small suppressed trees that are likely going to be dead in the next 5 years. Our total removals are really, really low. It's 7% of the total volume of the treatment area. And to give you a little bit more context, this is a photo I took during our field work. And one of the interesting things in the Tzouhalem area is that it's been thinned before. And this is great for us because it shows that our strategy for achieving our wildfire objective has been successful in the past. And it is what thinning that's happened in this forest is what's led to this beautiful forest that we have here now. And we're kind of taking that strategy and doing it again, but on a much lower intensity. And to give everyone a little bit of context, you can see in the middle of this photo a bunch of old stumps. I would guess this was done about 30 years ago, this thinning. And I would guess they removed probably 50% of the trees in the forest during this thinning. And you can compare that with what we're recommending, which is 7%. So much lower intensity, much less tree removal. And so our wildfire risk reduction objectives in the Tzouhalem area are first to ensure that BC Wildfire Service criteria. And the rationale behind the criteria the BC Wildfire Service provides is to ensure that this area is safe for their crews to go into for wildfire suppression, and to ensure that what we're saying is actually going to be effective in reducing wildfire risk to the public. And to do that, we use some fairly sophisticated modeling software where it's kind of an iterative process where generally we start with the lightest touch possible and we slowly increase it until we can get to meet those thresholds without overachieving and doing too much. Because we want to be adopting the lightest touch possible, not only because we're working in a sensitive area, but also because we want to the BC Wildfire Service wants to make sure that the most bang for their buck is happening so that they can treat as much area all over the province with their fixed budgets. And some of the non-wildfire objectives that are present in this area is the first, which I've alluded to already, is it's a very popular recreation area. We need to make sure we're protecting the trails, we're minimizing our impacts to the trails, and we're making sure that anything that does happen gets rehabilitated so that hopefully in a perfect world, no one even notices that we actually did this work. Another concern is the visuals of the site. This is a big concern in forestry on the South Coast, and there'll be almost negligible visual impacts. You'll be hard pressed to see a difference because we're keeping all the large trees that are really visible from a distance. Other sensitivities there is a sensitive ecosystem. So to manage that, I worked with a registered professional biologist, and I tell him where we're working and what we're seeing in here through our field work, and he provides guidelines to make sure that we're making sure we're not disrupting the functioning of that sensitive ecosystem. There's a wetland, I'll show you a map on the next slide, in the western portion of the site, and we're just going to buffer that area completely out. We're not recommending any fuel management activities take place in this sensitive wetland. Finally, road construction. Roads are a very large disturbance typically in forests, and luckily for us, we don't have to build new roads. There's already a suitable existing road network in this area. And so in 2022, as I mentioned, we're adopting a phased approach. So in 2022, you can see it's not the most visible on this map, but in the north, adjacent sort of the triangle and the car park, you can see a yellow line or a little yellow bubble around the Tzouhalem main there's the label on the map. So that's going to be the first phase of this project. And the reason we're doing this phased approach is so that we can the district can slowly take on this new scope of work that they've never done before. And also so that we can learn from this first phase and make subsequent phases more streamlined and identify any gaps in our implementation that we've missed. And it also, working on a phased approach will minimize the disruption to this public area. So the first phase is proposed for 2022. Future work will occur in ensuing years, take several years to take on the whole treatment area. The remaining wildfire mitigation work we discussed at the beginning of the slides is ongoing. There will be future open houses and meetings, and I encourage you to check our project website to get updates on this, and feel free to submit questions to that website. Camille and I are checking that email quite frequently, so we're happy to respond to any questions anyone has. Thanks for listening. Glad to not be talking anymore. It's always strange to talk to yourself for 20 minutes on these Zoom meetings, and we're happy to field any questions. We have about an hour left, so happy to open the discussion up.